I'd like to open our spotlight now to the panel, and I would furthermore like to discuss inclusion and identity and open up for Professor Fatima El-Tayeb and Momodou Malcolm Jallow. It's good to have you here, and thank you for being with us. Fatima El-Tayeb is a professor for literature and ethnic studies at the University of California in San Diego, so good morning. Her research on racism in Europe includes a focus on strategies for resistance and racialized communities. And her book, Un-German, The Construction of Others in Post-Migrant Society, is a sharp analysis of the blind spots in German and European history concerning xenophobia and racism, and we will talk about this later. Momodou Malcolm Jallow is member of the Swedish Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which appointed him General Rapporteur for combating racism and intolerance. Hi. He has led a landmark campaign against Afrophobia, leading several successful court cases. And again, a warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us. Following the spotlight with Olivette Otele, I'd like to pursue the question about inclusion and identity. And this question deals with the aspect of differences, distancing, and exclusion. When we ask about the blackness of European in our panel, I think we have to start with defining any kind of European identity and what does it consist of. I know that's a huge question, but maybe we can try to focus on that. And I'd like to start with Professor El-Tayeb. You have been stressing an excluding part of the so-called European identity. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that European identity is exclusive by definition. The way that European identity was constructed, because it's not something that's just there, right? It's not just like there were Europeans and then they had an identity. The idea of Europe was constructed, and it was constructed against another, right? So the idea was there are Europeans and they have distinct qualities, and those qualities are separate from those other groups that they were defined against. And this was constructed within a hierarchy. So Europeans are supposedly not only very different from, say, Africans, Asians, they're better, right? And it's a hierarchical structure that is superficially geographic. Europeans are different from Asians, from Americans, but the hierarchy means that Europeans were assigned particular qualities. So the benevolent version would be European identity is tolerant, civilized, democratic, advanced, egalitarian, respectful of individual rights. But those qualities always exist in contrast, not in comparison, but in contrast to other groups, those that are not European. And that could be the intolerant Muslim, it could be the primitive African, the fanatic Asian, all of whom cannot be European, not because they live somewhere else, but because their identity is fundamentally different. And that becomes important when we talk about Asian Europeans, African Europeans, and so on, because the idea is still that those people are not really European. And what they have to do at best is to become European. So what's that? In short, is a model of Europeanness that is white and Christian, and that still means that white Europeans own Europeanness, and Europeans of color are constantly asked to become properly European, but they really never can. So yes. It's of course, that's not all that European identity is, but that's at the foundation, right? So it is an exclusionary model.
Yeah, we have been talking about the othering and especially this transitory aspect you mentioned. You also write in your book, Professor Otele, you mentioned that African Europeans are mostly defined as travelers, citizens of the world or citizens of nowhere. Why is that still so, even in the second or third generation?
Well, I think that's
Sorry, the question was to Professor Otele, but then you are free to add.
I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Professor El-Tayeb, because as she clearly demonstrated and clearly explained, it's an exclusionary model that dates back to such a long time that we tend to forget that it was a construct. It was carefully crafted and then carefully distributed through knowledge and by teaching. So I strongly believe that this idea of never fully being European is still in existence, because there's resistance to that. And I find it quite interesting, actually, because we hear nowadays about the identitarians, the far-right group identitarians, who talk about native Europeans. And that actually makes me chuckle, because what's native, and when you put two words together who have such strong historical background, you cannot but actually wonder what they call natives.
Professor El-Tayeb, you wanted to add?
No, sorry. I just wanted to add that I think this idea of people being constant travelers rather than belonging is something that applies to African Europeans, but also to other racialized groups in Europe.
Yeah, that's true. You speak about this special definition of migrating societies. Mr. Jallow, you have been nodding all the time, so you do agree about this kind of definition. What are your experiences, even on personal level?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me, and I just want to really acknowledge and really agree 100% to the previous speakers, professors, when it comes to the definition and this the construction of the European identity to be exclusive and in contrast to other identities. And I think that is very, very much the truth. And when you talk about the European identity, it depends on who you ask, because when you look at the legal definition of European identity, it means that if you are born and raised in Europe, you become a European. It means that if you travel here and you get European passport, then you're European. But that is quite different from the reality, because the reality is that being a black man in Europe, it doesn't matter if you're born and raised here several generations, the reality is that you are not perceived as European. There is this incompatibility between black bodies and the European identity. If you are black, you cannot be European. And I personally have experienced that, and I know of many people of African descent that are born and raised in Europe, several generations, that constantly are questioned. Their identity is questioned on an everyday basis. And I will just give you one example of myself as a member of parliament, and I carry a passport that is equivalent to a diplomatic passport. And when I travel with my colleagues who are all white and we're traveling to another country, quite often it's very embarrassing that every single time, all of my colleagues would pass any borders, any airport, any security without a question, and I am the one that is stopped every single time. And when I ask, I always get the same answer, a random check. And even if I show my passport, which says that I'm a Swedish citizen and I'm a member of parliament, it says very clearly, sometimes they do ask me if that passport is fake or if it's real, because there's this incompatibility of my face, my body, my color to the European identity, and therefore it looks strange to them that a person like me would carry a European passport and a member of the European Parliament.
Yeah, this probably describes the best what has been said before. So when we speak about European identity, would it help, or there is this construction of African European identities? And obviously they are not convergent with the European identity. So Professor Tayeb, thinking the unthinkable, you once wrote, and thinking the unthinkable of an identity that is both European and non-white or Christian, as you pointed out. Why is this so difficult to reach?
Well, I think it is because the whole model understanding of Western modernity is built on binaries, right? Mm-hmm. It's always hierarchical pairs. It's inside, outside, European, African, white, black, male, female. straight, queer, whatever, you can go on. That's how we see the world, right? There are exclusive opposites. One is good, one is bad, and there's often a combination, right? So the qualities on the good side identify. It's, it's male, it's white, it's straight, it's European. So that creates an idealized, very specific understanding of what a fully human being is. And that can't be really changed by including more. What we instead have to do is come to a model that is not built on binaries. So it is so difficult, because if you have this binary thinking, if that's how your whole world is structured, you can't stop thinking like that in one area without questioning all the others. Which is exactly, what Olivette said before in the spotlight discussion. In order to change this understanding, in order to be able to look at Malcolm and see him as just European, we also have to think about hierarchies of class, of gender, of sexuality, and so on. So basically, that's not something that we ever are taught. So that's why it's so hard.
Professor Otele, you speak in your book about transnational and transcontinental alliances between African Europeans that are powerful, inclusive. Can you give an example of that?
Yes, those kind of alliances I mentioned in NAP and the European network of a group of people who came together as minority groups in Europe and who are looking at what has been happening in the last few decades in terms of discrimination, in terms of kind of racial profiling across Europe and so on and so forth, and who produce reports, I believe, every single year about what's happening in Europe. For me, that's transnational alliances. Transcontinental alliances are about the fact that these populations who are Europeans, of African descent, of Asian descent, of kind of American descent, these people are also part of other networks. For example, I use the example of people from whose parents were from Somaliland who are sending money, for example, abroad. It has been determined that the African continent receive a huge billion-worth amount of monies through kind of money transfer, simply because we belong to several continents. And we are attached and we are communicating in various communities who are working towards the same goal, which is an inclusive world.
Mr. Jallow, you have experienced a brutal hate crime in Sweden, and reading this kind of about these transcontinental alliances Professor Otele just pointed out, your story came into my mind, because when you experienced this hate crime in Sweden, you got a lot of support within the US. So would you say that this is a good example of one of those transatlantic alliances within the global community?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I travel to the U.S. once every year to attend what is called I think it's called the Black Caucus. It's a big conference, and this conference where you have all Black people working on all different kinds of issues, politicians, businessmen, activists. I travel there every year, and one of the reasons why I do that is because of what the support that I got from the U.S. when I was attacked and I had this issue of being threatened, my life being threatened, and I went through a terrible time. And one of the people that really showed up and helped out and showed support is Reverend Jesse Jackson. And Reverend Jesse Jackson, as he's known as somebody that has been working with civil rights for a long time. And when he heard about this, he traveled, not only just sent a letter to the government, but he traveled from the US to Sweden, of all countries, and he met with the government representatives, he met with civil society, and he demanded justice. And that for me, it made all the difference. Because if he had not come to Sweden, my case would just be like any other case. It wouldn't be in the newspapers. Nobody would care about what's happening. So I made it my responsibility to travel to the US every year. And in this conference, what I do is quite often when we see stories about Black people being targeted by police officers, we see racism and racial brutality of the United States African Americans. African Americans normally think this only happens in the United States. So they do not have, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them do not think beyond the boundaries of the US, that there are Black people elsewhere in Europe who are going through exactly the same experience as they're going through in the US. So quite often it is us, Black Europeans, that would show solidarity, that would go out in the streets and demonstrate when a Black person, a person of African descent in the US is attacked. But you don't see the opposite. So when this happened to me, I felt the need to travel and to explain to the African Americans and the civil rights movement that we have brothers and sisters on the other side of the continent, and we need to build alliances. We need to be able to see the pain and the trauma that we have in common. We need to see the experiences that we have in common and build alliances in order to be able to support each other, because that's the only way that we'll be able to successfully make an impact in trying to eradicate the kind of racism that we go through from both sides of the Atlantic. So I think it is extremely important in the work that we do to build these transatlantic alliances.
Mm. And it draws a certain spotlight on European handling this case. Speaking of, Professor Tayeb, you often speak about, or you speak of racial amnesia in Europe. What does that mean in classification to colonial amnesia? Where's the difference?
Well, the process might be the same. What I mean with that is that there's often this idea that we don't know about this other history of Europe, right? We don't know that there have been Black people in Europe forever. We don't know that there have been Muslim Europeans forever. But that's not quite true. For one thing, many of us do know. And for another, forgetting very often really means suppressing certain stories. So as has been mentioned before already, what we teach our children, what we teach all children, the kinds of history we pass on, because history is, as Olivette has said, a process of constant rewriting and recreation, defines how we see the past, but also how we see the future. If we think, for example, well, multiracial Europe, that's something completely new. So we as the majority Europeans need time to get used to it. That's one story. But if we know that Europe always was multiracial, then the story becomes, well, why then do we always act as if that's something entirely new? And the reason for that is what I call racial amnesia, the fact that there is a certain understanding of Europe and reality is adjusted to that, rather than our understanding of what Europe is being adjusted to reality. And colonial amnesia is in a certain way a part of that by not really forgetting so much that Europe has a colonial past, but by claiming that it's not relevant to the present anymore, and claiming that it's something that was not ever central to Europe, that colonialism defined the colonized parts of the world, but not Europe. So the idea that colonialism was not as important to Europe as, say, the First World War or fascism is a very common one, but it's also completely wrong, because every part of Europe was affected by colonialism. And of course, what decolonial theory says is that we're still in a state of coloniality. So there's really no colonial past. It's ongoing into the present. But basically, it's understanding that our perception of history is dynamic. And that's true for our personal lives and for societies, right? There are certain things that we like to forget, but it's an active process. So that the problem with that is that there is a kind of constant repetition, right? So every 10 years or so, Europeans have this epiphany and they think, well, maybe racism is not only something that exists in the US, maybe it exists here. But that then gets forgotten again until the next time it comes up, so that we go in circles forever and ever.
Yeah, we had this in the spotlight, Professor Otele. As you said, we keep on repeating the same discussions. I'd like to stick to that point because, especially when you say, Ms. El-Tayeb, that the European idea or understanding of colonialism is that this history has no impact on the continent. What is needed to bring back this knowledge of racism or this other understanding of racism or colonialism into Europeans' minds?
Who are you asking?
I'm looking at you. I'm sorry. This is an awkward situation. I have been looking at you all the time, and I'm sorry. First question to you, Professor El-Tayeb.
Well, I think that the problem with the discussions of racism is that it's often treated as an extreme on the periphery of society, and the painful process that we have to go through is to understand that racism is produced out of the middle of society, and that there's a kind of normalcy that is outside racist murders like happened in like Hanau in Germany. When these things come to the forefront, that is deeply shaped by colonialism, by our understanding of race that has been superficially rejected but still shapes the perception of different Europeans. So that requires a more fundamental change, starting with seeing colonialism as something internal to Europe. So there are obviously long-term effects on transnational, transcontinental relations, right? I mean, there are tens of thousands of people dying in the last 20, 30 years in the Mediterranean trying to come to Europe. Mostly people who are African, most of them Muslim. And this relationship, both the desperation of people who come, but also the ability of Europe to just let them die, to be generous, really looking at the European reaction, cannot be understood without the history of colonialism, cannot be understood with this deep set notion that some lives are worth more than others. And in order to think that, you don't have to identify as a racist, you just have to have gone through the European education system, and to a certain extent, the global education system. So I think one thing that has to happen is that we understand that this is a mindset that shapes all of us. It affects all of us in very different ways, which means that we have different responsibilities. So the first thing would be for Europe as a continent to really explore the impact on itself of the colonial past. And that includes the wealth that Europe has acquired, right? So what is needed is an understanding of global relationships that doesn't center European interests anymore. And that, of course, is a lot to ask from Europe, but that's what's necessary.
So this is analysis and definition of nowadays. My question now to the historian, Professor Otele, what caused the hardening of this racist European self-understanding and the European views about Africans, and why are they so persistent?
The cost is people dying. Why are they persistent? It's because as we mentioned earlier, it's comfortable for the majority group to stick and to stick to a narrative that allegedly constructed their identity. In other words, it's about who they see themselves and how they have been defined and how they continue to define themselves. So challenging that narrative is something that they see as a threat to who they are and to their, not just identity, to their deep psyche. So I believe that, as I said earlier, this challenge is a threat, but it's also necessary to kind of move forward. I also wanted to, if I may, respond to what Professor El-Tayeb was saying earlier, which is about decentering. Decentering is an important work that needs to happen. This is why we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum, the museum, and other places. It is about putting aside, deconstructing the canons, but also putting aside the idea that there's a center to the earth that is the birth of knowledge, and that is Europe. Because that has given birth to so many damaging perceptions of people who are of extra-European descent, and therefore that continues to enforce discriminatory practices and processes, systemic racism to the highest level. So understanding that is already a big step, and there's a pushback even to understanding that.
Mr. Jallow, you often speak about Afrophobia in this context. Can you explain what you mean with that?
Yes, thank you very much. This is a term that we started using here, and it is not a non-contentious term because people always would say it's not a phobia, this is racism, and it's quite different from a fear. It's not about being afraid of Black people. And the reason why we decided to coin this term here in the European context and the movements that we have here is basically because we came to a point where whenever we talk about racism at all levels, we can talk about racism against white people. They call it reverse racism. We can talk about all other forms of racism, but not talk about racism that affect people of African descent, Black people. It is always, a topic that people don't want to talk about. So we realize that one of the great strategies that other groups have adopted, for example, if you look at Muslims, they don't want to somehow mix the specific kind of racism that affect Muslims. They chose a term, they coined a term, which is, anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia. When you talk about anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia, you cannot mistake that to mean any other thing except the specific kind of racism that affects Muslims. When you talk about anti-Semitism, you cannot mistake that to mean anything else or except for the direct and the specific kind of racism that affects the Jewish community. So we thought, now that racism, the term racism has been so generic and everybody's using it, and it is leaving out people of African descent and the specific type of racism we face, then we say we need to coin a term that will specifically refer to the kind of racism that we face. Now, when it comes to the phobia part, what we have discussed is that this is not what we meant when we coined the term. It's not the fear of Black people, because racism is about power and privileges. Now, the fear of losing power and privileges to Black people, that's what we're talking about. And we have examples of this in so many occasions in history. If you look at apartheid, the apartheid regime, one of the reasons why they constantly refuse to give up power is the fear of what would happen if we give over power. And that fear is what we're talking about, that in Europe, there is this fear of losing power to Black people. That's why you don't see Black people being elected in high offices. If you look at the Council of Europe, I think we are only 2 people of African descent in the entire Council of Europe. If you look at the European Union, it's the same thing. If you look at all these big institutions, it's exactly in Germany. If you look at your Bundestag, I think you have 1 or 2 people of African descent. So even though Black people have been living in Germany and in Europe for hundreds of years. So we need to find a language that would focus attention to the specific kind of disparities, specific kind of hate, specific kind of racism that Black people are facing. And that's the reason why we chose that term. I just wanted to quickly also mention something that was brought up here by Professor El-Tayeb. I totally agree. I think this centering, and I totally, the question that you asked, that how can we somehow have a global relationship that does not center Europe? I think that's a very relevant question, because, and it's a difficult question for Europeans, because they are always throughout history have seen themselves at the center. And therefore, anything else would provoke a reaction that we see when we talk about this question. When we say, maybe we should start looking at the relationship, the global relationship that we have, Europe and then the South. Maybe we should start, decolonizing the museums. Maybe we should start decolonizing the literature that we have. Because there is this African proverb that says, the history of hunting would always glorify the hunter until the lions get their own storytellers. And it's about time that Black people tell their own stories. And that's one of the reasons even we coined the term, because this is something that we, not the oppressor, not the colonizer, but Black people themselves coined the term and said, this is a language we want to use, and we want to also describe it and define it, in our own term, without you dictating to us that this is wrong because phobia means this and that and that. And that's the idea. It's about empowering ourselves and using language that we ourselves came up with. And I think we have partly succeeded in doing that, because now that term has been used by the United Nations, the term has been used by the European Union, the term has been used by the Council of Europe. Even though we get resistance not only from non-Black people, but even within the Black community, we get people that still do not want to use the term. And lastly, in European countries, some European countries speak the language that they speak. The term Black, if you should use the term anti-Black racism, which is used in the UK, which is used in the United States, the term Black in several languages in Europe is the N-word. If you should translate it directly, Black, they use the N-word. So if you should translate or use the term anti-Black racism, and you translate it in certain European languages, then you will be reproducing racist terminology by using the N-word. And that is something that we do not want to see. And that's why we want to stick to this term, Afrophobia.
Thank you. So this was another aspect to the curriculum, other curriculum Olivette Otele demands. I would like to stick to one thought you had, the question of fear and giving up power. So this probably, or I assume that this is going to be the answer to my question to you, that Black people have been encountered for many years in Sweden and Europe, but it obviously is so hard to admit. Why is that, Mr. Jallow?
I'm not sure I got the question. Can you repeat it, please?
Why is it so hard to admit that Black people have been in Sweden and Europe all over the time?
Yeah, because the story of people of African descent and Black Europeans, they remain widely untold, or at least they have been suppressed, rendering many of our past and present contributions to political and social life of Europe invisible. That's the problem. It is important because we need to be able to tell our story. We need to be able to in the Swedish curriculum, we don't learn anything about Sweden's relations to Black people. We don't learn anything about Sweden's relations to the transatlantic slave trade, that Sweden was involved in enslavement of Black people. Even the UK stopped 1907 and Sweden stopped 1947, which means 1847, I mean. Sweden stopped enslaving Black people 40 years after the UK stopped. They continued enslaving and selling and buying Black people 40 years after the UK, which was the biggest, stopped doing it. So that history is not taught in schools. So when you talk to people in Sweden about Black people and their role and their contributions, historical contributions in Sweden, people say, no. Black people started coming here 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because they don't know this history. And now that we have done research from civil society and presented these facts and say, this is fact, this is history, still now, Swedish authorities, the Swedish society refuse to acknowledge its involvement in this history. They refuse, and in Parliament, myself and some of my colleagues have presented motions in Parliament for the acknowledgement, official acknowledgement of Sweden's role in the transatlantic slave trade. And every single time this is presented, it is rejected in Parliament. And I don't understand why, to be honest, because this is fact. And they know this, but because Sweden has built up an image as one of the best countries in the world that has not been involved or known for any form of human rights violation, so therefore, if they should officially acknowledge of this involvement, that will somehow tarnish its image. It is the United States, it is the UK, it is Portugal, it is every other country, but not Sweden. And that is why I make it my responsibility whenever I speak about transatlantic slave trade and I talk about Sweden's role, I emphasize the importance of people learning that Sweden has been an active player in the transatlantic slave trade. The UK and many other countries were buying iron that was used to chain enslaved Black people from Sweden because Sweden produced one of the best irons in the world. This is fact. This is fact. And it's important to be able to accept and acknowledge this fact for us to be able to talk about the contemporary kind of racism that Black people are facing in Sweden and the rest of Europe. If we do not acknowledge and accept the realities of our colonial past, then we will not even start talking about what we need to do to repair the damage that is until today affecting and impacting people of African descent.
Acknowledging the past leads me to a question, Professor Otele, where you said that fighting racism is a long game and we are at a starting point. But you also, and I might be wrong, but you also, in a way, you refuse seeing race as a barrier. So what would be the alternate way to deal with race?
I don't understand. Race as a barrier?
Yeah, I read in an interview that you refuse to see race as a barrier. Is that correct?
It is correct, but I don't know the context of which that sentence was taken. But perhaps what I meant by that is that kind of racial subjugation and racial discrimination are not the be-all and end-all. Again, I've taken, I think I remember now, I've taken the example of Bristol to say that, you know, racism exists and yet communities have managed to organize and get organized on a daily basis to fight racism. And what we're seeing, for example, in Bristol at the moment, and have seen a year ago with the toppling of the Colston statue, was that it was mainly a movement that was directed by young white people who toppled the statue and refused to accept that a slave trader was at the center of the city. So, you know, our understanding of race has evolved and what it means to young people.
So speaking of the youngest development, for a long time, racism has not really been discussed in Europe or acknowledged in Europe, as all of you pointed out. Instead, the fact has been neglected, more or less. But the Black Lives Matter movement had an enormous impact. How to use this movement, actually, in order to change today's situation in Europe. Mr. Jallow, you nodded. When Black Lives Matter is a protest movement, how to translate this into politics for a change?
Yes, I think Black Lives Matter movement is extremely important, and it has provided us with a window of opportunity to be able to really capitalize and start putting, you know, race relations on top of the agenda, political agenda, especially here in Europe. This was one of the elements leading to a report that I'm writing right now on the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe on Afrophobia or anti-Black racism. I don't know if you can imagine this, but the Council of Europe has been existing for over 70 years. And they have never, as far as I know, written a report or a resolution that is specifically targeting people of African descent to protect their rights, even though this is one of the world's biggest institutions and guardian of human rights. We have written reports on everything that you can think about, everything that you can think about, every group that you can think about, but not a resolution that focuses on people of African descent. So I thought this is a window of opportunity that I can use to be able to write this report. And BLM, the Black Lives Matter, have gathered support from leaders and the public in Europe, and they created this window of opportunity. And it needs to be seized with no hesitation. And that's exactly what I'm doing. And it's a movement that has no boundaries. We know this because discrimination against people of African descent is not limited to the United States. As I said, it also exists in Europe. And let me just, if you allow me, borrow Dr. Philomena Esset's words that she said, and I quote, probably the only common European experience among many, if not all, Afro-descendants is their exposure to racism and systemic discrimination, regardless of country, socioeconomic conditions, gender, age, or level of education. And this is true. This is a reality that we know that affects every person of color, every black person, every person of African descent in Europe. But yet, we do not do anything about it. Throughout all these years, throughout all this, colonial history that we have, and all these black people that live in Europe, we don't have a single legislation at European level that focuses on people of African descent. We don't. And it's mind-boggling to think that, Europe is this continent that focuses on human rights. But human rights for who? Because black people are seen as the other, and therefore we do not have the same human rights as everybody else. And this is a fact, because if you look at Germany as an example, where you are, there are so many cases. I'll take just one case, Wuri Jallow. Maybe that name rings a bell. Wuri Jallow, a black man that was killed. He was murdered in a police cell in Dessau in Germany, burnt alive. He's still fighting to get justice. His family are still fighting to get justice. And there are so many Wuri Jallows, and this is before George Floyd. This is before George Floyd. And there are so many George Floyds long before George Floyd happened in the US. In Europe, people that are killed and murdered and harassed by police officers. And we've seen this happen so many times, and yet you never see political leaders stand up and say, we need to act. We need to make sure that we protect the rights of these people. Why don't we do that? Yes, because not everybody's lives matter. Black people's lives don't matter as much as white people's lives in Europe, and that is a fact. So that is why, as a politician, as a policymaker, I have a responsibility, and a specific responsibility when it comes to raising issues concerning people of African descent. And this report that I'm writing has exactly that objective, to make sure that I put the spotlight on people of African descent, the challenges that we face, our historical experience and contributions to Europe as a continent, but also our challenges and how to address those challenges, to make sure we have legislation in place to protect the rights of people of African descent living here, whether you just arrived here or whether you historically have been living here several generations. It doesn't matter. That is an obligation that we have.
Mm-hmm. Professor El-Tayeb, you often experience that the self-perception of Europeans is not understanding race. What kind of impact does this attitude have?
Well, the most obvious impact is, of course, that Europeans can think that they're not racist. And that goes back what I said earlier and what others said earlier too. There's this hierarchy that was created with the idea of Europe, in which whiteness is not only on top, but whiteness is everything. Whiteness is not having a race. Only if you're white, you can just see yourself as human and nothing else. If you are racialized, and certainly if you are black, you cannot stand in for humanity. So what that means basically is that there's this idea that Europe is white and therefore there's no race in Europe until people of color enter Europe. And that always happens just about maybe 10 years ago, as we have said, right? It's thousands of years, but the perceptions is always, it's very new. So I think one of the major differences between Europe and the US, for example, is that there's no way that US society can deny that there's a history of racism. There are people who claim that racism is almost over, as bizarre as it is, but what Europe can do is say, well, we never had that problem because we never had race. What you're talking about, we're all white. So this thinking is, of course, at the foundation of racism, but it also allows to negate its existence, and that puts racialized people in the position of always having to say again, well, we're here, and actually we're not the first, and we have been here. And the problem is that is not something that will lead to the moment when Europeans who identify as white suddenly say, oh yeah, oh yeah, that's true. Okay, you can be European too, because it's the structure that needs to be changed, right? So part of that is if European societies really become accountable for the history of colonialism, that would be something that would stop Europeans from being able to say, but we don't understand race because we never did it. No, I mean, Europe invented it. So it's a function of privilege and power. If you're in power, of course, the power that you have is to deny that you have any responsibility.
There's actually one question about the European construction of identity by Birte Förster from the University of Bielefeld. And she asked, is identity construction not necessarily binary since it is always about including people and excluding others? Don't we need a complete different concept and should not only provincialize Europe, but also say goodbye to the idea of an European identity altogether, because this will always be racist at its core? Would you agree to that, Professor El-Tayeb?
Not necessarily. I think we have to get rid of the binary understanding of identity, but the alternative to that is not an idea of like there are no differences, but instead a model of difference that is not exclusionary, that you can find, for example, very much in the tradition of Black feminism, right, which is about confronting our differences and seeing them as something that is ultimately enriching and not threatening. But you also see it in indigenous understandings of relationships, right, which again are very central to decolonial theory. So the idea that we are all related, right, which doesn't mean that I can't say I'm European and my experience is different from yours if you're Australian, but it means that one experience is not necessarily automatically better, more relevant than the other. So I do think it's very, very important that we come to an understanding of identity that is both aware of difference and acknowledges that we are in a constant state of negotiation. But yes, we absolutely have to get rid of this binary model. I think the big challenge is that this model, this European model, is so dominant that it's incredibly hard for people, especially in Europe, to imagine that there is another model of relationships that would not be one that completely denies difference and says, well, we're all the same, which then, of course, ignores the fact that we are not all the same because we have not been treated all the same. And we have to address that. But I don't think it's impossible. But what it requires, as we all have said, is a decentering of Europeanness, but also of other binary structures around gender, for example. So yes, it's get rid of the binary model, but no, this is not the only model, I think, that we can have in a world in which Europeanness still means something. It just has to mean something different than it means now.
Yeah, actually, this leads to another question by Alina Wagner, who asked about who asked about the moral values. We often tell ourselves that racism is about moral values when it actually lies in the survival of systemic powers. Do you see intersectional attempts in politics on the European level? And how does it look like in the light of the COVID pandemic that affects communities of color disproportionately? I know that the COVID question is another one, but I would like to stick to the moral question and the moral value question. I don't know who would like to answer. Mr. Jallow, would you like to take that question about the moral values and any intersectional attempts in politics on the European level?
Thank you very much. The moral issue, I think we should move away from the notion that racism, or at least our role in tackling racism, is a moral responsibility rather than, it's a legal responsibility, because at least from the point of view of a politician or somebody that makes policies, it is important that moral values are important, but it is most important to look at the legal values that we have and legislation that we have that protects people. And as a member of the Council of Europe, it is extremely important to mention that the European Convention of Human Rights, it protects every human being. The human rights of every human being. It doesn't make a difference if you're a person of African descent or if you're a white person or not. So therefore, we are obliged, not only morally, but legally, to make sure that we do everything possible to address the racial discrimination and inequity that Black people face in Europe. And I'm aware of the fact that there have been numerous efforts by the public and private sector to address racial discrimination and racism against Black people, Afrophobia, including, there has been introduction of the anti-discrimination and equality legislations, laws that we have at national level. We have National Action Plan. Germany is one of those countries that have that. But that is not enough if we do not actually implement these legislations. And that is the case when it comes to people of African descent. Even though there are legislation, general frameworks that protects the rights of every individual, regardless of your color, when it comes to people of African descent, it does not apply equally. And that's where the problem is. Mm-hmm. It does not apply equally. And there is a structure. There is a structure that protects the system. There's a structure that if you are a person of color and you get killed, just like this Wuri Jallow was killed, there is a structure that protects the perpetrators of those crimes. Simply because Wuri Jallow is a person of color, simply because Wuri Jallow is a person of African descent. Because if Wuri Jallow, and there are so much evidence that points to this, if Wuri Jallow was not a person of color, if Wuri Jallow was not a person of African descent, the results would have been different. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we need to be aware of, is a fact. And unless and until we acknowledge of this, we are not moving forward. It is not a moral issue, but it's a legal issue.
And it's a question of equality. So I would like to stick to that question of equality and equality representation. Professor Otele, creating stories of resistance or of community collective cohesion or intercommunity collaborations, as you mentioned in an interview before, this would help to sort of understand equality and pursue equality. Who needs to write those stories that will lead forward or will lead to equality?
Primarily for me is the people who are living, whose lived experience have been affected by these stories. So it is about people sharing their own stories, people from minority ethnic groups sharing, and actually it participated what is key to me, which is knowledge production that will be shared by the majority group later on, but it's coming from grassroots organizations, coming from communities. And this question actually for me is linked to the previous one about the moral value of so-and-so. We know that racism is not about individuals, it's about systemic institutions and systemic racism. So if we remove the onus on the individual, and we put it and we understand that it's a system that has been put in place for the individual not to worry about being racist, then counteracting these with communities' outlook and communities' stories and communities' organization and processes of actively resisting and actively fighting discrimination, then we have a better chance of understanding that there are ways, successful ways to do things differently. Successful ways to rebuild communities and to rewrite the narratives of the past and the narrative about living together. So I strongly believe that this teaching has been there. It's like the untold, so-called untold history. These teachings have been there and have been shared amongst minority ethnic groups throughout centuries, and they need to come out more forcefully now and need to be given the platform to be shared widely.
Professor El-Tayeb is breaking the silence, telling other stories, and those stories Professor Otele has been speaking about. Is that enough? Would that help?
No, I think that's obvious, because those stories are being told, they're just not heard. And the reason for that is, if they're heard and if they're really processed, that would require material changes. And you know, that's where the problem lies. It's both ends, right? These stories have to be produced, but I think that's not the problem. They are produced, but then they need a platform. But if you have a platform, then you can instigate change. And that's the point of those stories, right? So there's a resistance to change, and that is indeed structural. It's often economic. It has to do with a very low number, as Malcolm has said, of Black politicians, for example. It's also true for if you look at universities, right? The people who actually have the positions, where you have like this glaring whiteness all across Europe. And again, that is not enough. We can see that here in the US, where the number of scholars of color, of politicians of color is much higher, and that makes a difference. But it is not enough. It's part of the process. But you know, there's a difference between passively sort of giving racialized groups their 5 minutes, and then you're like, oh, we did our duty and move on, or actually listening, right? Because that listening requires action. Mm-hmm. So those stories are not enough, but they are fundamental. But that would also mean that, you know, we have been doing our part for a long time.
Actually, I'd like to place one question by Claudia Döring, who is a teacher, and she thanks you all for these positions she can totally agree to. However, as a teacher in a rural area in the eastern part of Germany, where teenagers have not much experienced any multicultural life themselves, she's asking herself how she can help to create an environment of identity building of young people to become European in the sense of thinking beyond national borders on the one hand, and not falling into the trap of these exclusive ideas of what have been described before. So the question would be, how can she make her students listen? Professor Otele.
I'm smiling because I used to be a primary teacher, a secondary teacher, and university teacher later on. But as a primary and secondary teacher in rural Wales, I always find ways to teach those stories, simply because colonial stories permeate the whole of Europe. So it means that even if these students have not had a chance to engage with various communities, there are stories that can be taught to them. The history of sport, history of food, history of cloth, history of, you know, so many of them that they can actually engage powerfully with and connect with. So I think that it's just a case of of thinking about that as a teacher, and I sympathize immensely with teachers.
So sticking to education, there's a question that, again, Claudia Döring asked, that she has no multicultural roots of or friends herself, so she has no experience beyond literature, arts, and other stories she has read. So what can, for example, the education process do to create a post-exclusive European identity? Would you like to answer again, Professor Otele, since...
The education is there to open the world it's not about proximity, physical proximity to certain stories. It's about the emotional connection, and it's also about the passion that one has about teaching others about the way the world functions. So I believe that the teacher, Claudia, if I may, I believe that you can do this because you have, I believe if you're asking the question, you have the will to do so. So I'll be happy to engage with you.
If I may just add,
sure.
If that's okay, I just wanted to say one of the things that the professor mentioned is not about the physical closeness to people of color. I mean, you can still teach history. And one of the things that I would like to see in Germany, especially in Berlin, that might help even in the teaching of of Germany's colonial history is that we all know in 1884, 1888, when the Berlin Conference took place, where they divided Africa into small pieces, where you had all these leaders of the West. There is no trace of that in Berlin. Not a single. I mean, when I traveled to Berlin, I remember my first time in Berlin, that was what I thought about. And I asked my friend, can you show me where they had this meeting? I would like to see that building or that area. And she told me, no, that is gone, long gone. Now they have other buildings there and there's no trace whatsoever of that history. Now we need to make sure that our colonial history is present. We cannot somehow deny it or make it invisible. That is one way of teaching our people that Germany has been having a relationship, even if it is a colonial relationship, but it is the fact, it is the truth. And it's important that we have some kind of monument, some kind of, whether it is a museum or building or whatever, to be able to teach our people, our population, our citizens, that Germany has been engaging with Africa, and this is what Germany has contributed colonially, in oppressing or whatever to the African continent and people of African descent. That history is important, extremely important, and that's a message that I'm putting across to your politicians. Make sure, try everything that you can. Just like we have, I visited the Jewish monument, extraordinary, extremely important. We have students traveling all the way from Sweden to go to Germany, to Berlin, to visit and to learn. We have a small place that you have in Berlin for the Roma. People travel there and they learn the history. They don't have to be Roma, but they learn the history of Europe and the Roma population. In the same way, you can also have something that people can learn from your colonial past and understand it, even though they are young and they did not live during that time, but they can still learn about that history. That's a message to you and your politicians.
Thank you. That was a clear point, and that was already an answer to the question of Marie-Louise Jansen, who has exactly asked whether it's time for this kind of memorial or history.
Actually, can I just add quickly something to that, coming back to the storytelling, right? Because there are, of course, already are decolonial city walks. There are already activist groups in Berlin that are trying to rename streets from the names of the colonizers to the name of the colonized. So it's not even an issue for the politicians of creating anything. It's just sharing resources, giving resources to the people who have been doing that work already.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Thank you. Actually, time is running not really out, but we still have a little time left. And in the opening session of the Körber Forum yesterday, I learned that the Harvard way to conclude a discussion is a positive outcome. So I'd like to take a look into the future, assuming that it's going to be optimistic. I'd like to start with you, Professor El-Tayeb, looking at the impact of exchange and cultural transfers, and in a way, you just added these kind of exchange and cultural transfers by the grassroots and situation in Berlin, where the colonial history is been told. What is needed to elevate those relations and honor them with greater appreciation?
Well, I would say really for those who had power, for the majority to actually step back and listen and to share resources, because oppressed peoples have always been extremely resilient, and they have created connections and they have created narratives of their histories. And this is happening now as it happened before. So I think we can be fairly optimistic in the sense that it becomes more obvious, I think, that the Western model is not working even for the West itself, and we're running out of time, and there are many alternatives. And I think what is needed mostly is for the majority, for those in power, to look at those alternatives, because what is happening on the side of those who have been oppressed and marginalized is already building alternative models and building connections. So that is where I draw my optimism from. And my hope is that there will be more openness to actually implement those alternative models.
Mr. Jallow, how optimistic are you for positive change in terms of race relations in the European Union?
I'm optimistic because I do not have any other choice. Because if I'm not optimistic, then there wouldn't be any point in me doing what I'm doing and all the other people that are fighting every day for change. So I have to be optimistic. But central to any fight for equality is the call for justice. By this, I mean justice in terms of reparations for the historical injustices that we have endured as people of African descent, as Black people. I mean justice in terms of accountability for the violence, discrimination, and inequality we continue to experience even today. And I also mean justice in terms of equal access to rights, freedoms, and opportunities now and in the future. And we need to make sure that that is in place, because if we do not have that, then there is no chance that we'll be able to create an environment, a society that is free from racism, that everybody will be able to enjoy, the best potential that they have in life. And lastly, I think, and this is at all levels, both at the EU level, but also at national levels, we need some kind of solidarity. We need resources. We need coordination for strong networks and alliances and coalitions to tackle this racism that people of African descent face. As activists, as NGOs, as policymakers, we need to make the links between experiences of people of African descent across the world and find global solutions. And it includes the links with the fights against other forms of racism. We cannot only look at Afrophobia, but we look at the links between Afrophobia and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and the fight for gender equality. We need to make those links because they're extremely, extremely important, and have this broader recognition that all oppression is connected, and therefore all fights for justice must be connected too. So for me, that's extremely important, and that's why the work that I do as a general rapporteur, I look at all forms of oppression and try to find a way to make the links and to make to create an understanding that we need to find these links in order to be able to establish a stronger impact that we can have in the fight against these kinds of hatred and this kinds of discrimination and this kinds of racism that we face in Europe today as people of African descent.
Thank you, Mr. Jallow. Professor Otele, we started out this discussion, the two of us, so this is the last question and the last statement by you. Where to rely on and what narratives should be continued?
The narrative that we should continue are the ones that are in my book. It's the narratives of those people that we tend to forget and remember and forget again to break the cycle. Where do we rely on? Relying on the fact that, communities have been fighting for centuries. They know what they're doing. They know what to do. And as Fatima and Malcolm said earlier on, it's time for the majority group to learn from this and put the resource in, because it's a question of resource. This is where we are stuck. It's the resources. Put them in and make it happen.
Thank you very much. Professor El-Tayeb, Mr. Jallow, Professor Otele, thank you so much for this discussion and exchange about how Black Europe is. It has been my pleasure. I have been learning tremendously, and I'm sure we all learned a lot and received an enormous input to think further on. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Körber Forum, I'd like to say goodbye to the audience at this point. I kindly ask the registered participants to stay online, and for the others, goodbye and have a good evening to you too. And now the floor is Gabriele Verdelkos.